This tutorial is going to show you how to make a crumb catcher that suspends underneath your hook-on high chair. Any type of fabric will work just fine. In this video I'm using a faux leather for the liner and a canvas for the outer fabric. Here's an example on how to lay out the pattern. The printout only includes the semicircle, so you'll just need to use a ruler to measure the rectangle before you cut. And you'll repeat these cuts twice, once on your outer layer and once on your liner. The first seam will be attaching the sides to the rectangle. The curved edge of the side matches up with the long edge of the rectangle. I don't find that I need to pin this before I start sewing, but I do have to pull the fabric and make sure that the two edges are lined up along the edge of that curve as I sew. And this is a seam that you'll repeat twice for the liner, and then you'll repeat it another 2 times to sew on the sides of the outer fabric as well. Don't forget to pay attention to the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. Another tip to keep in mind is you're actually just making 2 exact copies of the same bag, and then you'll put them together later to hide all of the seams. After we get done sewing on the side panels, it's time to attach the cord, and it really doesn't matter if you decide to sew it onto the liner or the outer fabric. I chose the outer fabric because it was easier to work with than that faux leather. As long as you're sewing it onto the short side of the rectangle, you're going to be just fine. Don't forget to center your cord before you start sewing. That way the 2 tail ends will be the same length when you get finished. I'm also just sewing this as close to the edge as I can using a zigzag stitch. I find that letting the cord run along this edge gives the final product a little bit more stability. When you get done with the cord, you're going to put the 2 bags one inside of another with their right sides touching each other. And I like to line up the 4 corners of the bags and either pin those or clamp them together. This seam will actually go all the way around the top. You need to start right before the side of the rectangle where the dowel rod is going to sit. And before you finish the seam, leave yourself about 4 or 5 inches so you'll be able to turn it inside out. Keep the tail ends of the cord just tucked down inside the bag, and you're going to just run right over those with the sewing machine, and they'll turn out the right way when you turn it inside out. Also notice how I'm just keeping the sewn part of the cord to the right of my presser foot. It will just disappear into the inside of the bag. Now you can see I'm just running over the second half of that cord. And on this side piece here is where I'm going to end the seam. I'm leaving myself some room to turn this piece inside out. And this is the hole also where you're going to be putting the dowel rod in. So off camera here in a second, I turn this thing inside out, and before you insert the dowel rod, you need to go along that seam and just sew a little channel where so that dowel rod will sit and not just fall down into the bag. I don't sew that seam around the entire thing. I only do it on the short edge of the rectangle. As a little side note, as you're watching me sew this, normally you wouldn't have to pull on the fabric so much like I am here, but my faux leather was not catching on my little feed. I don't show it in the video, but I did trim my dowel rod down so it would fit inside this. Once you've inserted the dowel rod, it's time to sew this up by hand, and I'm going to use a ladder stitch. And to start that, you knot off the end of your thread and you go inside of the piece, and with each stitch you just take a little tiny bite of fabric on one side, and then you go over to the other side of fabric, take a little bite, and you go across 3 or 4 times, and then you pull it tight, and it should make the seam disappear. So I'm going to leave a little tiny gap that's over closer to the dowel rod so that if I ever want to wash this, I'll be able to get that in and out. I attached these suspender hooks by hand on the dowel rod side, and they are about 8 inches apart from the center. An alternative to these is just a safety pin. You can always just pin that up to the bottom of your hook on high chair. Here's a shot of what those cords look like when you're all done and everything's turned right side out again. This is a shot of how I've attached it to the table using a suction cup. If you're using the temporary adhesive hooks, I would probably put those on the bottom side of the table just so that they would be out of sight and out of the way. That's it for this tutorial. Happy sewing!